Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in this video what I want to do is just kind of explain to you like the basics of HTML forms and at their default level, so not using any JavaScript DOM manipulation, just how they work by default. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new HTML file. We'll just call this form page or form.html. This is literally just going to be an HTML. We're going to put our HTML boilerplate in here using Emmet. And I'm literally going to just put in a form. So basically what happens is that you have a form HTML tag. And what it does is that any inputs that are in the form are treated as sort of one unified thing. So we'll show you a couple different things you can do with this. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we are going to, and generally the form has the ability, like usually nowadays you use like JavaScript and you'll grab the form via DOM manipulation or using a ref in React, or you'll grab the form in some sort of way and use JavaScript to dictate what the form does. But the form itself actually has built-in mechanisms to tell the form what to do when you submit it. It generally has two properties: action. And the action takes a URL, basically saying, okay, you want to submit it to this URL. I'm just going to have it submit it to itself. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to do /form.html. So it's going to make a request to that URL, which literally is just this file itself. Okay, so it's just going to submit it to itself. And then you can submit what kind of method it should use when it makes that request. So typically you only have two choices here: post or get. Okay, if you generally want to do something else like a put request or a delete request, those would require something called a method override, and that requires you to do stuff on the back end. So you can't just do it purely here from the form. But just from the HTML, I can specify, hey, where should the result of the form be submitted to, and what kind of HTTP method should be made, which could, again, get or post. It's going to be your two options. It defaults to post because typically you're submitting a form and you're posting data to like a database. Okay. And then we can have inputs in here. So I'll just have an input that, and then each input has a type. There's several different types of inputs. So we'll say a text input. Generally, it's very important for you to give it a name, because the name of the input is going to be generally how it submits the data. Like it's going to determine, like, do we submit the form, like the data from this particular input, what do we call it? You'll see what I mean in a second. So we'll call this like first, just so we see it has a different name. And then you can put a placeholder, which puts like it doesn't actually put something in there. It puts like a light explanation of what should go there. So, words. Okay, we'll say write words. And there's a bunch of different types of inputs. I have a separate video that goes over the different inputs on my HTML form basics video. And then we always want to have some sort of way to submit the form, which you could either use a button. So you can use a button tag, and that'll, as long as it's inside of a form tag, it's treated as that form's submit button. Or you can use a proper type equals submit button. So it's an input of type submit, which is a submit button. And if you want to change what it says on the submit button, you can right here, like, click this. Okay, and that's what it'll say on the button. So there we have a form. Okay, that's all it is. Basically, it's a form tag wraps a bunch of inputs, and when the submit button is clicked, it's going to submit a request to this URL using this HTTP method. That's essentially what's happening here. So now I'm going to open this up with Live Server. Okay. Now watch what happens when I submit the form. So I'm going to type in cheese. Now look at the URL. So now notice that I went to the URL, and because I made a GET request, it actually adds the data from the form at the end of the URL. This is called a URL query. And when you submit the data in this format, it's called URL encoded. So this is why, like, in most backend frameworks, you'll have to use some sort of middleware to decode this URL encoded data. You don't see it when it's a post request, because GET requests always expose this data. This is why generally you don't use GET requests for submitting a form. I'm doing it so that way you can see that this happens. But technically that data, and notice how it uses the word first. See, it uses the name property of the input to determine like how this string should look like. Okay, now I can do some cool stuff with this. So now I'll bring in some JavaScript with a script tag. So I can just manually write some JavaScript here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, const, or we're just going to do this. We're going to do alert, and I'm going to alert, and we're going to pass in the window.location. So the window object represents the browser. The location represents the what website the browser is looking at. And in there should be a parameter, I think it's called search. That's like that URL query. So if I alert, let me just spell alert right, alert. So see what happens when the page opens. See, it's alerting that query string. Now if I type something else in, I type in hello, then I click this, because again, when I click this, it's going to submit it, and I have the URL, that action property set to submit it to itself. So it's submitting, and then the JavaScript runs and says, hey, look, I'm alerting the query string. Okay? So essentially that's all the form is doing. It's just submitting this string of text to wherever I want to submit it to. I'm literally submitting it to itself, so it's not doing much. But typically you would make a post request, and you would submit it to some route in your backend server that would receive this string. The middleware parses this string, and then you can then do stuff with it. Okay? And that's how you receive. It usually gets passed in as the body of the request, because post requests have a body. That's why you don't see it in the URL, because instead of passing this string as part of the URL, it passes the string as part of the request body. But it's still in the same format, like this syntax here. So if I had multiple inputs, like let's try having multiple inputs. Let's see here. Let's also have like a select input. And the select input has many options. Okay, so we'll just say one. I'll just comment out this alert for a moment. Okay, and then we'll just give this many options. Okay, and then this will be 2, 3, 4, 5. But I still need to give this a name. So we'll say the name equals second. Okay, and then we'll have like another input. I'll just delete this for now. Actually, we'll just make this a console log so it's a little less annoying. Window.location.search. Okay, and then we'll add like a number input. So we'll hit input type equals number, name equals third, and placeholder num. Okay, so let's take a look at our page. So see, now I have the thing where I can write some text in. I got this drop-down menu that's a select option where I did those different options. Choose 3, and then num where I can put any kind of number I want. Now if I click this, and see, notice like all that form data is now in that query string. So first equals blah, 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 and second equals 3, and third equals 34. It takes the data from the form and turns it into this URL string. That's why it's called URL encoded. Okay, it's written in a format that allows you to transmit the data via the URL. So again, oftentimes you'll see that middleware. It's often referred to as like URL encoded in your backend framework, whatever language you're using. That's if you're using forms the old school way. Okay. Sometimes people will have the forms, they'll override using the form this way and use JavaScript instead. Okay, but by default, anytime you submit a form, it's going to want to try to use that action. Okay, which means it's submitting a request. It's going to want to refresh the page. So this can be really annoying when you're using things like React, or you're trying to make an API, do a form to submit to an API request. So then what you can do, if you don't want the form to do that default action, you want the form to just be there and do the thing, you can then override that in your JavaScript. So the way we would do this is I would grab the form. So I'd say const form equals const form equals document.query selector form. So I'm grabbing the form tag. Okay, and now what I can do is if I want to, I would add a event listener to it. So I would say form.add event listener, and I'm not going to listen for a click. I'm going to listen for a submit, because when you submit a form, that's a different event than when you just clicking on a button. Okay, so I'm going to hit a submit event, and again, just like any other event in the DOM, we pass it a function, and that function can receive the event object, which we'll look at in a second. So I'll console log the event object. Okay, so we can see what we have in there. Okay. But first thing I want to do is also I want to do event.prevent default. That's going to prevent the page from refreshing. Actually, let me do it without first. So now watch what happens. I try to, I fill out the form. Oh, it's complaining that's. And see, the page just refreshes. I don't want that to happen because I want JavaScript to dictate what happens. So when you're doing an event listener and you're instead of letting the default form behavior do like just before where it uses the action, if I want JavaScript to take over, what I have to do is do a prevent or event.prevent default. Okay, this is going to stop that refreshing from happening. Okay, now let me console log the event. So let me just submit the form. I click and see now it didn't automatically refresh the page. So if I open up the browser, or I mean the DevTools, I'll see that there's an event object. I can take a look at it. And the cool thing is that I can find all sorts of really cool information here. Okay, so let's see here. Like path here, just kind of shows you where it is. This is just normal stuff you'd see in any event. Then like, there's some special stuff here for form. So let's look up that form. Okay, so in the form element, provides us with a lot of special things when you're using a form. I forget all of them. There's like actually methods to clear out the form and different things you can do. Elements, lang, last child. Let's see if it has all the data in that one nice little object for me. I don't think it generally does, but Gmail timestamp. I go to D, dir, draggable. Dataset. DOM string map. Value of. That would require me a little bit more digging. Autofocus, capitalize. Seeing here, form. I mean, here I can access all the inputs underneath it, so I can. There's this array of target that's in there, so I can technically like access that. But really, at the end of the day, what matters is, so I can be like this. I can like do like console log event.target, which would be the form. And then in there, we saw that the form had like these indexes that were numbers, so I can access 0 and console log it. And if I do that again, I'm just going to submit the form. And see like the input box is the next thing there. And if I want to grab the value of that, I can just do like dot value. Okay. And if I do this, and there you go. I see I'm accessing the value of that first input. I could do it that way. And again, the point is that like I can then like just do what I want here to work with that form. Okay, I can access the different inputs in there. So generally you're going to know how many inputs there are in a form because you made the form. So I know that there's going to be 1, 2, 3, really 3 inputs here that I really need to grab data from. Okay. Now the other thing I can do is just so you know just about the inputs in general, so you can set them with a default value. So for that you'd pass like a value prop. So I'd say like value, we'll say hello, and that'll be the default value. So now when the form first loads up, it's going to have hello in there to begin with, and then I can change it. And I can do that with any of these inputs. So I can be like, and for the options, a nice little trick here is that what if you wanted to say like 1, but you want it to equal the number 1? So I can then over here be like value equals 1. Okay, so that way when I select 1, even though it'll say 1 in the drop-down box, the value for the purposes of like JavaScript is going to be 1. Okay, so if I can go here and I can select 1, and then let's see here. I'll just submit the form for a second. Do I have a console log anymore? Did I get rid of the console log? Oh, I did get rid of the console log. Console.log event. Okay. Okay, so now if I go to the submit event, I go to the target, which is the form. Then I'm going to go to the select input and go look up the value. So look up the value property, which is what the form is currently, that particular input's currently worth. Elemento QRSTUV. Where's the value? Elemento. Oh, there's more here. I see. Value. There you go. And see, the value is the number 1, not the word 1. So even though I selected 1, that select option will then use the value. So that overrides what it says on the select box in case, because for example, if you want to do like models of a car, but what you really want is a serial number, you'd put the serial number as the value, but you'd want to put the model name here because more people are going to recognize the model name, not the serial number. Things like that. So hopefully that gave you some more oomph for understanding like the world of HTML forms. There's a lot more you can do with HTML forms. Each of these inputs have like lots of properties for like validation, so you can limit like what people can type in there, whether people can type in them, and then you can actually toggle that off using JavaScript, so that way the form is only enabled once they fill out like another input. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do, but this should give you sort of a better idea of at least just like at their basic level how they work. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.